So, unless you've been living under a rock for 2,000 years, you know that the belief that Jesus Christ was raised from the dead is essentially the cornerstone of the Christian faith. According to the New Testament and most modern Christians, Jesus was crucified by the Romans, buried in a tomb, and rose from the dead 3 days later. It is said to be a miraculous act of God that demonstrates Jesus' divinity. However, skeptical people like myself find it extremely difficult to accept that the resurrection is a true historical fact. So I've decided to go through some of the reasons why I believe that it is unreasonable to actually believe that Jesus was physically raised from the dead. There are quite a few reasons why I believe that the resurrection is problematic, but I've narrowed it down to four main reasons for the sake of brevity, though this will be quite long. The first reason is that it is based solely on the four gospel accounts. According to any serious biblical scholar, the four Gospels were written anonymously several decades, or up to almost a century by some estimations, after Jesus' death, and were definitely not written by eyewitnesses. This is backed up by the fact that they contain inconsistencies in their accounts of the resurrection. As an ex-history major, I can say that in the discipline of history, it is essential to understand an author's biases and motivations when evaluating a historical text. Anonymous writings, while still useful, are less valuable in historical analysis because it is almost impossible to determine the author's true perspectives and motivations. Understanding an author's biases is crucial to accurately interpreting and contextualizing historical texts, and it helps historians avoid making inaccurate or incomplete conclusions about the past. Also, even ignoring the fact that we have no way of knowing who wrote them or what the originals might have said, the Gospels contain irreconcilable internal contradictions in their versions of the resurrection. For example, the Gospel of Matthew describes an earthquake that occurred when Jesus rose from the dead, while the Gospel of Mark, the earliest of the Gospels to be written down, makes no mention of it. The Gospel of John, the last of the Gospels written down, contains a different sequence of events altogether, with Mary Magdalene being the first to discover the empty tomb, followed by Peter, then the rest of the disciples. The fact that these accounts differ from one another suggests that they are not based on eyewitness testimony and may have been altered or even embellished over time. Another issue with the Gospels is their use of literary devices. The authors of the Gospels were certainly not writing historical accounts in the modern sense. In reality, they were writing theological narratives intended to convey a message about the nature of Jesus, his significance, and the significance of his sacrifice. We know this because they repeatedly use literary devices such as allegory and symbolism to convey their message. For example, the Gospel of Matthew describes the dead rising from their tombs and appearing to many people in Jerusalem after Jesus' resurrection. This event is not mentioned in any other gospel or historical record and is certainly a symbolic representation of the significance of Jesus' death and resurrection. Finally, the reliability of eyewitness testimony in general is frequently called into question because human memory is imperfect and subject to distortion, especially over extended periods of time. Like I've already said, the Gospels were written decades after the events they describe and were likely based on the memories of ancient people who had their own biases and agendas. Additionally, the stories were transmitted orally before they were written down, which introduces at best one layer of hearsay to the story and at worst a dozen layers, which almost certainly increases the probability of errors and changes over time. So the unreliability of the Gospels as evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is a significant issue that cannot be ignored. The fact that the Gospels were written anonymously, not by eyewitnesses, contain internal contradictions and inconsistencies, use literary devices, and are based on orally passed stories all suggest that they are not reliable historical records. While the Gospels may provide insight into the beliefs and values of early Christians and possibly some historical accounts of someone that resembled a historical Jesus, they cannot in any way, shape, or form be taken as proof of a physical resurrection. The second reason is that there are no contemporary or extra-biblical historical accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. While the Gospels provide detailed narratives of the resurrection, these accounts, like I've already mentioned, were written decades after the event and are not considered contemporary sources. In fact, there is not a single historical account of the resurrection from the time period in which it is said to have occurred. This absence of contemporary accounts is particularly significant because of the cultural and historical context in which the resurrection is said to have taken place. First century Palestine was an area of intense religious and political activity, and the resurrection of Jesus would definitely have been a significant event worthy of contemporary documentation. However, there are no accounts from Roman or Jewish historians of the time that mention the resurrection of Jesus. Looking at extra-biblical accounts of Jesus, Christians often cite the work of the Roman historian Tacitus and the Jewish historian Josephus as possible sources of evidence for the resurrection. However, while Tacitus and Josephus may have mentioned Jesus in their works, their accounts are not sufficient evidence to believe in the resurrection. Firstly, it is important to note that Tacitus and Josephus were not contemporaries of Jesus. Tacitus wrote his Annals in the early 2nd century, while Josephus wrote his Antiquities of the Jews in the late 1st century, meaning that their accounts were not based on any first-hand knowledge or eyewitness testimony, but rather on second-hand information, hearsay, and rumor. Additionally, Tacitus and Josephus never wrote about the resurrection specifically. Tacitus mentions Jesus only briefly, stating that he was executed by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Josephus provides a more detailed account of Jesus, but again does not mention the resurrection. Instead, he describes Jesus as a wise man who performed miraculous deeds and was put to death by the Romans. While these reports may provide some historical context for the life and death of Jesus, they are certainly not evidence for the resurrection. Instead, their accounts are consistent with the idea that Jesus was a historical figure who was put to death by the Romans. However, they do not provide any support for the belief that he was actually resurrected from the dead. The third reason is that the resurrection is a miracle claim, or a claim that goes against all known laws of nature. When miracle claims of any kind are examined through a rational lens, it becomes clear that believing in miracles is inherently unreasonable. David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, laid out his arguments against miracles in his essay Of Miracles, contained within his 1748 masterpiece, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. I have read the book, and while a lot of it went over my head, Of Miracles is pretty straightforward. In it, he provides a framework for understanding the irrationality of accepting miraculous claims. Hume's argument centers around the concept of evidence and the nature of miracles. He suggests that miracles by definition violate the laws of nature and are fundamentally improbable. According to Hume, the evidence required to establish a miracle must be extraordinary, as the weight of evidence should always be proportionate to the claim being made. He writes, "No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish." Applying this to the resurrection of Jesus, we see that it is just as reliable as any other miracle claim. The accounts of the resurrection found in the Bible were written decades after the alleged event and are based on hearsay and the preconceived religious beliefs of the culture from which it sprang rather than empirical observation. Hume's skepticism towards miraculous claims is obvious in the statement, "There is not to be found in all history any miracle attested by a sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to secure us against all delusion in themselves." Without compelling empirical evidence from reliable witnesses, accepting any miracle claim, including the resurrection, as a historical fact is simply unreasonable. Taking it a step further, Hume also raised the issue of conflicting miracle claims in different religious traditions. He goes on to argue that since miraculous claims exist in opposing faiths, each with equally devout believers, it is unreasonable to grant authority to any particular miracle claim based on the testimonies of its followers. The fourth and final reason that I will list is that the resurrection story itself, while not an exact copy of earlier myths, is at its base similar to other resurrection stories from ancient mythology. Many ancient cultures had stories of gods or heroes that died and then returned to life. It is very possible that the resurrection story was influenced by these earlier myths and was intended to convey a similar message. One of the most obvious similarities between the resurrection of Jesus and other ancient resurrection stories is the motif of dying and rising gods. This motif appears in many ancient religions, including the myths of Osiris in Egypt, Tammuz in Mesopotamia, and Attis in Phrygia. In each of these myths, a god dies and is reborn through a miraculous or supernatural process. The story of Jesus' resurrection follows a similar pattern, with Jesus dying on the cross and then raising from the dead. Additionally, many of these ancient myths include a narrative of the god descending into the underworld or the realm of the dead. This pattern appears in the story of the harrowing of hell, as Jesus is said to have descended into hell to save the souls that have been trapped there before rising from the dead. Similarly, in the Egyptian myth of Osiris, Osiris descends into the underworld to become a king of the dead before being reborn as a living god. Another similarity between the resurrection story of Jesus and the other ancient myths is the supposed existence of witnesses who testify to the resurrection. In the Gospels, the resurrection of Jesus is witnessed by Mary Magdalene and other women and some of the disciples. Likewise, in the myths of Osiris and Attis, witnesses testify to the rebirth of the gods. These witnesses are often portrayed as being skeptical at first, but then, by some bit of evidence, become convinced of the supernatural nature of the event. But I have to admit, while these similarities do not necessarily disprove the resurrection, they do highlight how the story of Jesus fits into the broader patterns of ancient religious thoughts and myths, and makes it at least probable that the resurrection narrative is an early Christian attempt at relating to foreign audiences. So, there are very compelling reasons to believe that the resurrection was not actually a historical event. The contradictory and unreliable nature of the Gospels, the lack of contemporary or extra-biblical historical accounts, the violation of the laws of nature, and the similarity to earlier resurrection myths all suggest that Jesus' resurrection is more likely a legend than a historical fact. However, I acknowledge that I may be totally wrong and encourage anyone to share their perspective and challenge what I have said. No one has a monopoly on truth or knowledge, and a range of perspectives can help us widen our understanding of these complicated and very pervasive topics. So feel free to respectfully disagree with me, offer alternative views, and/or help me see where I have made a mistake. And like always, if you made it this far, thank you for watching and have a wonderful day.